What's up, everybody? You're listening to Obsidian Radio, the voice of the everyday brother. And it is Fun Friday, January 26, 2018. Welcome to the program. Glad you can make it, and thank you for listening. I appreciate it. I've been a bit lax and tardy in my acknowledgement of the various children of the zodiac. It is the time, the age of Aquarius, if you will, this time of the year. So I want to give a big shout out to all the water bearers out there. If you happen to be born under the 11th sign of the zodiac, many happy returns to you. 7 minutes past the hour, 32 degrees here in the city of brotherly love, home of yours truly, the old man. And many people have been contacting me and asking me what's been going on. Obsidian, haven't seen you in a while. Well, I have been a little bit under the weather. But aside from that and taking care of a whole lot of administrative stuff and all the rest, because, I got this huge pile of papers and, I need to move files around and all the rest of it. And by the way, while I'm on that point, I want to give a big shout out and special thanks to a friend and supporter of Obsidian Radio who really helped me out with regard to the file management problem here at Obsidian Radio. You know who you are. Thank you so much for that. I'll be talking about that in greater detail in the official and exclusive Obsidian Radio newsletter. How do you get the official and exclusive Obsidian Radio newsletter, you may ask? Well, how you get that is you become a Patreon subscriber or PayPal donor. Stay tuned for more details as to how you can be down and join the team. But I wanted to get to this particular topic. There's so many things to get to. People want my take on the situation, the latest situation with actress and comedian, the one Miss Monique, and have been asking me about some other topics and want me to weigh in on. And we will get to them by and by. But I wanted to get to this particular topic because it's really important. Over the past week or so in my convalescence, I had a chance to catch up on some documentary watching. That's the big thing for me. I love documentaries, and because you can learn so much from them in a way that may be a bit more limited if you're just stuck, you're just limited to reading books. And what I've been studying over the past week or so is what historians now refer to as the Cold War. Really interesting film, came out a few years ago, starring Tom Hanks and directed by Steven Spielberg, called Bridge of Spies. Bridge of Spies. Very good movie, and it discusses one very prominent event during the Cold War that I won't go into right now. I don't want to spoil it for you in case you haven't seen it. But my reason for bringing all this up, the Cold War, the Bridge of Spies movie, is because something really occurred to me in my convalescence earlier this week. And that's this. If you will recall a recent podcast I did where I was addressing fellow black man YouTuber The Angry Man, I pointed out in that podcast that there is a conflict of visions. I borrowed that concept from Professor Thomas Sowell, who even has a book by the same name, A Conflict of Visions. His argument is that there is essentially there are two ways of looking at the world. If you're on the left, you see the world this way, and if you're on the right, you see the world this way. He breaks it all down. I borrowed that concept and applied it to contemporary black American discourse. That there is fundamentally a clash of visions, a conflict of visions between two types. And I suggested in that podcast regarding Angry Man that this conflict of visions can even be distilled and personified by him and me. I would like to suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that the conversation that has now been sparked with the help of social media, increasing availability of communications tech, and so forth, is now at a point where we can start to see this conflict of visions emerge. there really is a war of ideas, and that's the reason why I bring up the Cold War, because when you think about the Cold War, it was really a war of ideas, with the West, led by the United States, with its focus on rule of law, the individual, and economic prosperity. Would they will out, or with the Soviet Union, the East, the Iron Curtain, led by the Soviet Union, with their focus on the collective, with their focus on communism, and the like, would they will out. And it was a massive propaganda war. This is the reason why I mentioned that movie, Bridge of Spies. And what really clicked for me earlier this week was the fact that that's what you really have going on. Everybody remembers comedian Chris Rock and I would argue, his most famous stand-up routine ever, talking about there was a civil war going on between black folks and niggas. He was correct, but he didn't take it one step further. If you go back and listen to that routine with what I'm saying right now about a conflict of visions, about a war of ideas in mind, you'll see it. But he didn't explicitly put it the way I'm putting it right now. There is a war of ideas going on in Black America. Okay? And until very recently, and I say within the last decade or so, one side in that war of ideas, if you will, has pretty much had a bully pulpit. Who am I talking about here? I'm talking about black women. And I'm also talking about their allies. They did have allies among black men. They just didn't do this alone. But it's largely black women who had the bully pulpit for at least 3 decades. I take it back to The Color Purple. Others may take it back farther. That's fine. I use as a touchstone or as a starting point The Color Purple to promulgate a certain type of idea about black men in particular and black American society overall. And for a long time, black men, for a number of reasons, didn't have a clapback, if you will. That's changed over the past decade. More and more black men are raising their voices in opposition to this particular narrative and worldview, and are presenting a countervailing worldview, a countervailing vision. That brings me to a series of videos that have been brought to my attention by one of my friends and supporters of Obsidian Radio, one of my most ardent listeners, who had suggested that the author of these videos, these podcasts, the one and only Miss Kendall St. Charles, also known as Brooklyn Bellevue, Blue Cheese from the Moon, My Nigga Can You Dig It, and Crooklyn Bellevue, she has done over 5 hours of audio presentation arguing for a particular point of propaganda that she refers to as the cleanup woman. Now, this is in direct response to a number of us in the Brother Man regiments with regard to the concept of the cleanup man. So this is very interesting, and I've decided to, in the spirit of what I've already laid out, this war of ideas, this conflict of visions going on in Black America, what I've decided to do is to directly address Kendall St. Charles's most recent spate of podcast, over 5 hours in length, I might add. I guess the old saying, brevity is the soul of wit, it's completely lost on her. I decided to go and to directly, point for point, respond to and refute everything she's been saying in that series. That's what we're going to be doing here at Obsidian Radio, among other things, because it's very, very important. If we've learned anything coming out of the Cold War period, and many historians document the advent of the Cold War with President Harry S. Truman's The Truman Doctrine speech, March 1947, all the way to Christmas Day 1991, when the Soviet Union was officially abolished and the Russian Federation was born. Of course, a few years before that, you had the fall of the Berlin Wall, That brings us back to the film Bridge of Spies. I highly urge that you check it out. So we're looking at, almost 50 years of Cold War fighting. Largely in the form of proxy wars, largely in the form of propaganda wars, etc. There was a serious war of ideas. So this is the reason why I'm bringing that imagery into today's discussion on what I refer to as the cleanup woman fallacy. Now, you may recall a little while back I addressed something else Kendall St. Charles has been saying ever since she got started in March of 2016. This idea of a no nigga diet. I have addressed that canard as well. And in fact, it was so hot that I couldn't post it here on YouTube. So you're going to have to go over to my Patreon page and check it out. I'll dig up the link and you can find it and you can go from there. So this idea of a cleanup woman. Kendall St. Charles argues that it's not the cleanup man idea that's really at issue here. It's the cleanup woman at issue or idea that's at issue here. Forgetting the fact that, and many of you will recall that I recently did a revisiting of a classic podcast that I dropped I take that back. That would have been in late 2016. Why I refuse to be the cleanup man. I recently did a revised and expanded edition of that podcast called Why I Still Refuse to Be the Cleanup Man 2018. It'll be in links in the comments section below if you missed it. I think it's pretty fair to say that yours truly was the one to coin that phrase, cleanup man, in the context of now what has now become a true conversation, however much Ms. Kendall St. Charles would like it to be otherwise. Because she talks about how she doesn't debate people, she doesn't debate men, she doesn't go back and forth with them. But she's listening to my podcast and she's responding to them. So again, it evokes that Cold War imagery, where if you're on the side of the communists, you're against freedom of expression, you're against debate. Understandably so. I mean, if you looked at the Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev kitchen debate, you'll see the reason why those on the left, those who are communists, they don't want open debate because they suck at it. So I understand the reason why Kendall St. Charles doesn't want to go mano a mano with the old man. I understand that. She's not completely stupid. She knows that she'll get her head handed to her 7 ways to Sunday, going mano a mano with yours truly. She knows that. So what she does is she does this kind of anti-intellectual thing, which to be fair is not just something that is unique to Kendall St. Charles. It's a kind of skein of thinking in Black American thought that has developed over the past, I would say, roughly 3 decades. It's dating back to the late 1980s, around the same time that the Soviet Union fell. That kind of goes something like this, and matter of fact, if you listen to Black Gnostic Speaks' videos, if you listen to Uncle Dave Carroll's videos, it's often expressed like this: I only debate my equals, all others I teach. Now that's a line that comes directly from the late historian John Henrik Clarke. And whatever his intent was in saying that, what it has become to be known as is a anti-intellectual out to prevent you from having to actually defend your ideas in the public square. This kind of thinking is pervasive in Black America, and we're going to get to the root of where that comes from in a moment. Stay with me, I'll make it plain. So when Kendall St. Charles says I don't debate people and all that, that's really where that's coming from. That's coming from this idea of John Henrik Clarke, which would play a big role in a certain skein of thought in Black America that we're going to be examining in a minute, which is crucial to understanding the current situation today. Keep that in mind. So in a way, this really is a kind of Cold War situation between me and Kendall St. Charles, because this isn't the first time that she's made videos responding to points that I presented. So this is a kind of proxy war type of thing because she won't directly engage me. Again, understandably so, she'll get her head handed to her on a platter if she did. So she continues on with the propaganda. A war of ideas. A conflict of visions. So what is this idea of the cleanup woman? She argues that black women have been cleaning up black men's messes for 1,000 years, of course. You know, is strong on assertion but weak on empirical evidence. She offers none. As a matter of fact, have you ever noticed that the overwhelming majority of her material never actually cites sources that you can then go back and research for yourself? Have you ever noticed that? Compare and contrast to the old man, where if I do a podcast and I don't cite sources where people can go back and check, I'm going to be hearing from listeners. You know, there's been a couple of times I posted up a podcast and neglected to post up the links to this, where I'm getting all my material from, and I'm actually hearing from listeners both publicly and privately, like, yo man, where are the links? That's because we here at Obsidian Radio have established a well-known reputation for being able to back up what we say. And we open up the books for everybody and anybody to go back and research it themselves. And if I've made an error, they have the opportunity to say so. Not so with Kendall St. Charles. Again, a conflict of visions, a war of ideas, East versus West. You see what I'm talking about here? See, in America, we can talk about freedom of speech and freedom of expression, being able to interrogate the ideas of somebody else in the public square. But see, in the East, you can't do that. You try to do that, and you wind up in the Gulag Archipelago. Look it up. So she argues that black women have been the ones to clean up after black men. She offers no empirical evidence. Meanwhile, yours truly, in both my original podcast, Why I Refuse to Be the Cleanup Man, and its more recent follow-up, Why I Still Refuse to Be the Cleanup Man 2018, in both instances, I offered sources that you can go back and independently check and verify for yourself. As the Gipper once famously said, and he was a huge player in the Cold War, one of our country's greatest Cold Warriors, trust but verify. Isn't it interesting that Kendall St. Charles has no response to that point? We have actual evidence of black women not just asking or appealing for support, but demanding that a certain group of black men come and mentor their children, their kids, literally clean up neighborhoods and so forth. These are publicly published reports. Now compare that to Kendall St. Charles's blatherings about what happened 1,000 years ago. Compare and contrast. Let me say this in response to Kendall St. Charles's notion of a clean up woman. Madame, if there is such a thing as a clean up woman, then black women have deserved it. They brought it on themselves. Okay? Why do I say that? Because if they had gotten with the good brothers, they wouldn't have had to worry about cleaning up after somebody. Good brothers don't require anybody to clean up after themselves. They're quite fastidious and they can do a pretty good job keeping their own situation straight. And she proves my point. She actually proves my point. But before I get to that, let me point out something else here in this psyops propaganda piece that she puts out. Have you ever noticed that anytime, and this isn't just a black thing, you see this, giving a nod to our brothers from other mothers, they will recognize this too. As a matter of fact, I just read a piece by Rollo Tomasi of the Rational Male fame where he talks about this. Have you ever noticed that anytime a concept that explains the dark underbelly of female mating behavior is presented in the public forum and starts to catch on, have you ever noticed that the female response is, well, men do it too? For example, hypergamy. This goes back to Rollo Tomasi. Hypergamy. Now that's something that hasn't been scientifically investigated and verified is largely in the anecdotal realm, but because so many men from so many walks of life have witnessed the phenomena, it's gained a lot of traction. The response on the part of women is to say, men are hypergamous too. Have you ever noticed that? And so it goes. Any type of behavior that is unflattering to women, I'm just talking about women in general. Any type of behavior that's unflattering to women that men can document and measure and quantify, do a head count on, the response from women will be invariably, men do it too. In Black America, not only do we see this, but they often extend that et tu, which is a logical fallacy, is a form of ad hominem, et tu type of reasoning onto other people. For example, if black men document, and we can indeed document, quantify, and do a head count, literally, ladies, black women's reliance upon Wookiee weaves, hair hats, hair extensions emanating from non-black women to the tune of billions of dollars a year. The Wall Street Journal has documented this. If black men simply point this fact out, what black women will say is, white women do it too. White women wear extensions too. If black men document the morbid obesity problem among black women, black women's response is, black men are obese too. See, it is a disingenuous tactic designed to shut down any further discussion, because you cannot have any discussion about behaviors that are unflattering or unbecoming of black women. You can only have conversations that are about the unflattering or unbecoming aspects of black male behavior. But you cannot do it about black female behavior, because if you do that, well, the response is men do it too, therefore we shut down the discussion. Have you noticed that? So this is what Kendall St. Charles is doing with this cleanup woman nonsense. She doesn't offer any empirical evidence like I have twice now. No, she doesn't do that. What she merely says is that black women have been cleaning up black men's shit for 1,000 years. No evidence is offered. Where'd she get this from? And it's designed to try to stymie legitimate debate. No, Miss Kendall St. Charles, let me get my echo box so you can hear me clearly now. No! We will have the debate, whether you like it or not. So I've offered my sources that underscore and buttress my argument as to why I will not be the cleanup man. Those sources are available to anybody who wants to see it. We have evidence of black women themselves demanding that black men, a segment of black men that they wouldn't piss on to put out on a fire 10 years ago, now they want those same black men to come and clean up the community and mentor their sons. And if black men refuse, now there's a huge hue and cry. See, if you recall, keeping in mind the idea of a war of ideas, East versus West, keeping that in mind, everybody here will recall what I referred to as the educated lame debates that took place about a year ago, and how you saw that war of ideas really ramp up, because black women have never really had a challenge to their talking points and their ideas until very recently. Now they have a legitimate challenge to their ideas in the form of brothers like yours truly and others in the Brother Man regiments here on YouTube and elsewhere throughout social media. And now they're attempting to scramble to have a legitimate response. I'm sorry, Miss Kendall St. Charles, you will need to work a lot harder than that. Maybe if you do another 5 hours of propaganda programming, you might make a dent. Now, another major talking point that Miss Kendall St. Charles likes to use, and I've been just sitting back observing her for some time now, quietly. Another major talking point of hers, as a matter of fact, according to her, to let her tell it, It was one of her very first, I think it was her very first video that she did. She even gave the date, March 7th, 2016, called I Agree With You. What is she talking about? She acknowledges in this particular podcast, she acknowledges the critiques that black men have of black female behavior. What we refer to here on Obsidian Radio as black female fuckery. She acknowledges it. And that's very important. You know, before you can solve any problem, you have to acknowledge that there is one. If you never acknowledge that there's a problem, you can't solve it. So she needs to get kudos for acknowledging the legitimacy of black male critique of black female behavior. She's to be lauded for that. But see, here comes the trick. Here comes the fuckery, ladies and gentlemen. Here comes the trick. So what she says then is, well, the solution is we don't deal with black men anymore. Since it's clear that we have all these problems, we just shouldn't deal with black men anymore. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Just think about how, forget the disingenuosity of the whole thing. To forget just how intellectually dishonest that whole spiel is. Just use some basic Spock 101 reasoning here. Okay, so if someone is pointing out to you that there are problems in your program, and you acknowledge that there are problems in the program, but your response is, well, you don't need to use my program anymore. No. The response is, we need to fix the program so that it will be a much better and more pleasurable experience for those bringing it to our attention to begin with. Looked another way. If you have a car, and your car breaks down due to transmission problems, and someone points that out, and you agree that that's what's going on, and you say, well, the solution is I'm not going to drive cars anymore. Do you see how ridiculous this whole thing is? Obviously, the solution isn't to not drive cars anymore. The solution is to address the transmission problem that you have in your car presently. And see, what Kendall St. Charles does here is she reveals something that a lot of black women really think. See, I argue that a lot of black women really don't want to fix, quote unquote, the community. They really don't. What they want is to be able to call the shots over an empire of ashes. Because that's what the black community is now. I mean, look at all the stats. The stats bear it out. With a barely, I think it's like, with not even 30%, with an under 20% black marital rate at present. Can it be otherwise? See, a lot of black women really don't want to fix themselves. They don't. But they can't just come out and say that. Because if they did, then the cat would be out of the bag. They just can't come out and say, well, I ain't fixing shit. And they just take me as I am or not. Then you'll be understandable why they are, the Cleveland Browns of American women. If the Cleveland Browns just came out and said, we're not going to do anything to improve our team is just as good just the way it is, then it will be understandable why they just stay in the basement for year on year on year, decade after decade. Same thing with black women. So what black women have to do is give the dog and pony show. And this propaganda and scapegoating other people. That's what they have to do. Deflection and all the rest of it. Projection. See what I'm going on here? She being Kendall St. Charles acknowledges the legitimacy of black male critique of black female behavior. But her corrective isn't to say, ladies, we need to do better so we can get on point with our brothers here and actually have a meaningful conversation that will lead to meaningful action in terms of rebuilding our communities, because the basis of any community is the relations between men and women. No, she doesn't say that. Her corrective is to say we need to stop dealing with black men. Think about that for a minute. Let that sink in. Just deal with the sheer fuckery of that statement. The sheer intellectual dishonesty of that statement. And while we're on that point, let's consider something else. Notice how Kendall St. Charles justifies, because she uses the word contextualizes a lot. If you listen to these type of blacks, and I'm going to get into that in a minute, just hang on, I'll make it plain. If you listen to these type of blacks, they often use certain types of words in excess. And one of the words that Kendall St. Charles uses in excess is contextualize. See, you'll understand black female fuckery once you understand the context. That's really what she's saying. Let's put it this way. What she really means is she wants to make a case for justifying and rationalizing black female fuckery. This is very much a East versus West Cold War type of thing here, ladies and gentlemen. A conflict of visions, a war of ideas. Because that's what the Soviet Union did. If you know your history, you know what I'm talking about. Hang on, I'll make it plain. So, another major thing that she does in her disingenuous argument in the form of a podcast, I agree with you, is that she lumps in all black men. See, this is something else that is crucial to point out. See, it's completely okay to generalize all black men. Why is that? Why is it that when black men have a critique about black women, the number one response from black women is, you can't generalize us? But those same black women, either themselves or other black women that they know, are quick to generalize black men. Why is that? Why is that? Why couldn't Kendall St. Charles say, okay, I need to choose better among the black men? Why is that? Because black women like Kendall St. Charles have to demonize black men on a whole. You want to know why? Because that way they don't need to address their own fuckery. See, if you accept the premise that there are good brothers out there, if you accept that premise and you accept the fact that you've been messing around with ain't shit black men, the obvious solution is to stop messing with the fucked up black men and start messing with the good black men. That would be pretty obvious, right? But if you buy into the idea that this notion of a good black man is questionable at best, suspect at worst, that you can't distinguish between good black men and black men who ain't shit, then you don't need to change anything about yourself. Nothing needs to be confronted. No painful internal changes must occur, because all black men are like that. See how that works? And sadly, there have been a number of useful idiots. That's another term that comes out of the Cold War. Look it up. There have been a number of useful idiots among black men who have swallowed this line, hook, line, and sinker. Hence the self-flagellation meme that's also pretty pervasive in black American life that I utterly reject. I reject the premise. See, I come to this discussion with the following premise in mind. Black men are already on point. The problem that exists in black America ain't black men overall. There is a percentage of black men who ain't shit, but they're a minority. They're a distinct minority. The problem here is the majority of black women. Now, why can I say something like that? How can I say such a thing? Because the data backs me up. The numbers back me up. The anecdotal evidence backs me up. It's the majority. Anything over 50% is majority, ladies and gentlemen. The majority of black women. That's the problem. Their behaviors, their actions and deeds have given us a legacy of ashes. Okay? That's my argument. And if black women were to address their fuckery, they too would be able to land good black men, just as non-black women and even black women from other countries have. Because see, that's the fundamental Achilles heel in the argument of the Kendall St. Charleses of the world. And she's not alone when she says this. You know, I talked about Darth Hideous, Deborah Cooper. She's done radio shows. She's devoted entire radio shows to this notion that there's no such thing as a good black man. A little while back, I talked about the overgrown simp Derek Jackson. He's done a video questioning this notion of a good black man. Have you ever noticed, by the way, that the very idea of a good black man has to be subject to this, this proctological type of examination. Have you ever noticed that? We just can't accept the notion that there are good brothers out there. I'll tell you the reason why. Because so many black women have been fucking with that small group of black men who ain't shit. And instead of people demanding that they grow up out of their provincial attitudes and small-mindedness and their feelings and feelings and deal with the real world as it is, which will show and prove that there are a whole bunch of good brothers out there. No, they are allowed to run amok with their fuckery. Have you ever noticed that? So since, because, she goes into great lengths about how black men can't build anything and all the rest of it. I laugh at that because I literally came from a family of builders, and I did that myself for a good chunk of my life coming right out of high school. So I laugh at that idea. And all the men in my family, if they wanted to marry, they did so and stayed that way unto death. My dad, my granddad, quite a few of my uncles, etc. So forth. My older brother. And most of us worked in the trades. Most of us did. At a fairly high level, skill trades. Yours truly, myself, I was a machinist. Machinist, mechanic. I actually made things in real time. Because see, that's another thing that Thomas Sowell talks about. If you go back to his Intellectuals and Society, if you go back to his Conflict of Visions, he talks about this. A key defining feature of the left is that you just talk a lot. You don't have to prove anything. And if the ideas that you talk about don't materialize, you just move on to the next topic. Consequential knowledge does not meted out. See, I worked in a world where consequential knowledge was king. If what you was doing didn't work, heads had to roll, most notably yours. You had to actually produce something. So when she talks about these black men, because what Kendall St. Charles likes to do is she likes to jump back and forth between the educated lame type and the black men ain't shit type. She likes to jump back and forth because, again, her underscoring argument is that all black men ain't shit. That's her real argument. Just like Darth Hideous's main argument. Crystalline Karazin says it too. She tries to be slick about it, but she says it too. So this goes back to what I'm saying. A war of ideas, East versus West. The United States versus the Soviet Union. You got to study that, brothers. Malcolm X said it best. History is best qualified to reward our research. And what's going on in black America right now is a war of ideas. A conflict of visions.